Time now for our Friday roundtable discussion on some of the week's most important stories. Another wild week on world financial markets. From an international perspective, who are the winners and losers? Some intriguing signs from Iran. Is it headed back to a future with a more moderate president? And land reform in China. The peasants seem to be getting a little more power over their lives. Joining us now are Richard Haass, president of the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York, and Carla Robbins, deputy editorial page editor of the New York Times. Thank you both for being with us. All right, so it was another contentious week in the world markets here, and now there is discussion coming from Europe, especially to want to sort of rewrite the original rules that were done right after the end of World War II. Is that a good idea, Richard?
It's a necessary idea. The machinery in place is more than half a century old. We now have globalization in full force, and what we've seen in the last few days and weeks is the absence of adequate regulatory coordinating mechanisms. For example, you had a situation the other day where governments raced to change the level of deposit insurance in banks. So when Ireland did it, suddenly money started moving massively in that direction. You can't have that sort of thing, and that's just simply one of 86 things that we don't have in place, the rules, the mechanisms, and so forth. So what we've got to do is look at existing institutions, particularly the IMF, but also look at existing rules. How do we get, for example, everyone to agree to the same accounting standards? How do we get them to agree to similar regulatory standards? We have got to come up, you can call it a new Bretton Woods, call it what you will, but there's a gap between where we are and where we need to be in terms of dealing with the economic challenges of the era.
Carla, is that a tweak or is it a total rewrite?
Well, I mean, Richard's made a very good point, which is that the rules are very old and the world is far more interconnected, as we've seen, for good and now desperately for ill. At the same time, I can't imagine, the U.S. government agreeing to some super regulator or giving up sovereignty in a transcendent way. Sharing more information and working together quickly to make sure that the whole system doesn't fall down is a very good idea. We've seen a desperate failure of regulations here in this country and very serious problems of regulations in other countries. There's a need to update, a need to coordinate. I don't think there's going to be a super regulator because I know the United States would never accept it.
A topic I know that made you cringe when I said it was who are the winners and who are the losers. And yet there seems to be a consideration that Asia and the emerging markets are going to be the ones that come out much better off than the rest of us. Can we make a determination like that now?
Sorry, but no. There are no winners, except maybe the three people who were smart enough to move into cash a year ago. There are no winners. We're going to lose. We're looking at a recession. All this talk about decoupling is so much talk. If and when we move into recession, the Chinese will not be able to export to us at anything like the level they used to export to us. So quite honestly, we're all going to pay a price. This is a global reality because this is the era of globalization. Now, over time, over a century, yes, Asia's going to do fairly well. You will see the relative rise of China, India, so forth, but this crisis is not going to help anybody.
I've got to mention Iran real quick as we change subjects here. There was some indication.
And they're not doing well.
They're not doing well.
I just like to add economically that.
And they have two issues we saw this week. One, continuing talk about the possibility of a U.S. interest section. And then the other one is Mohammad Khatami, who seems to perhaps be talked about as a man who could challenge Mohammad Ahmadinejad. Let's talk about the U.S. interest section. What would be the benefit of that for the United States, Carla?
Well, the benefit would be, first of all, having people on the ground, sending a clear message to the Iranian people that the United States is not an inevitable enemy, might get more intelligence, more chance of some understanding. We haven't been there for a really long time. It's ultimately, there's also that sense from neoconservatives who've been backing this, surprisingly, inside the State Department and other people in the administration, this notion that you'll have thousands of Iranians lining up for visas to go to the United States, which would be embarrassing for the government. So there are a lot of really good reasons to do it.
You just set back the chances for it, however, considerably.
Well, interestingly enough, I hate to take credit for this, but I wrote the first story for the Wall Street Journal when I worked for it, saying that they were considering doing this. The second that story came out in the morning, they canceled a principals meeting at the White House so they could claim there was never going to be a meeting and never going to be a discussion about it. And then you didn't hear about it for another 2 years. This is such a sensitive subject, and particularly at a period of time when this administration is getting beat up over being too nice to North Korea. I think it's a really good idea. I don't think they've got the courage to do it.
But any signs of moderation here, perhaps?
I think two things. One is you're probably going to see the new administration continue this process of diplomatic explorations with the Iranian government. Second of all, the most interesting development in Iran, and we were getting at it a minute ago, is the fall in oil prices. If there's anything that's going to soften up this or the next set of leaders in Iran, it's going to be that. Suddenly they're not going to be quite so cocky. They're going to be more worried about sanctions, more worried about economic isolation. So watch that space and watch what happens in the spring 2009 elections. Right now, it's a changing context. Anything is possible there. It's quite interesting.
The third subject we were going to talk about, land reform in China. Your favorite topic, Richard.
I was reading up on it just the other day.
Well, I think what caught our attention to this was that it is possible this could impact 800 million peasant farmers, primarily in China. So it's a huge impact. But then the other question, what could be the impact for the American farmer?
It's extraordinary on two levels. Politically, once you give people land ownership, other things flow from it. Economically and politically, you're giving them rights. It's politically not an isolated phenomenon. Plus, economically, once people have rights over land, they can then raise capital. This then opens up markets. So if this happens, and everything in China that happens on an enormous scale, it is potentially big in terms of the evolution towards a more market-oriented country and towards, as well, a more politically open country. This is actually interesting, all kidding aside.
Mm-hmm. There seems to be some pushback, though, on the Chinese government on this.
Well, we were expecting them to announce it because the president and the head of the Communist Party has been talking about it publicly. They didn't announce it. Potentially they're going to wait until the spring meetings to announce it, or potentially he's getting pushback on it, and we really don't know yet.
Just in time for the planting season in spring. Carla, Robbins, Richard Haass, as always, we have more topics than time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.